The no vote against the Indigenous voice to Parliament is gaining ground. A six-person committee is leading the Recognise a Better Way campaign and includes high-profile detractors of the voice. Country Liberal Senator Jacinta Price and former Labor Party President Warren Mundine. Joining me live now is the Shadow Attorney General, Julian Leeser, for more on this. Thanks very much for your time. Just to begin with, I suppose, you have been known as a supporter of an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Is that, for now, still the case?
Well, Tom, I support the idea of an Indigenous voice to Parliament. I've been a supporter of the idea since long before I became a Member of Parliament. My reasons for supporting it is because I think you make better policy when you consult the people directly affected by policy. And particularly, I regard that as a Liberal principle. I also regard as a Liberal principle the idea that when you consult people at the lowest level, at the local and regional level, you get better outcomes on the ground. And we believe in the idea of subsidiarity. We've been calling for the government to provide more detail as to how these bodies are going to work, and to provide better processes and to respond formally to the Langton report, so Australians have a better sense of how this body that they're proposing will actually work.
So these 15 questions, if you're asking questions and saying our support depends on them, clearly you have some red lines in mind. So can you give us an indication of any of these questions? If certain answers came back in a certain way, when would your support be pulled? Can you give me any specific examples from these 15 questions on what you want the answers to be?
Well, Tom, we put forward these questions because the Prime Minister on the 28th of December went to the Woodford Folk Festival and said we'd have a referendum this year. The Minister on the 1st of January announced that there'd be some legislation coming to the Parliament in March and that we'd be looking at a referendum in August. And since Peter Dutton has been leader, he's been saying, look, we've got an open mind on this, but we're awaiting the detail. He's been saying it, I've been saying it. And we just haven't been getting much by way of response to some of these questions. And as I went around over the summer, and as I've been talking to Indigenous people in communities and Australians in my own electorate, I kept hearing from people who said they wanted to vote for this, but they didn't understand what it was, how it would work, and how it would change lives and affect policy on the ground. And those questions that Peter put to the Prime Minister are really designed to try and elicit some of that information. Reasonable Australians are asking reasonable questions, and we should have some response to those.
Well, let's go to some of them. And one of the questions is just how much it will cost. If you're asking that question, you must have in mind, what, a certain cost limit? Is there a certain cost that would be too much for you to then support it?
Look, I think this is just a fundamental question people should be able to ask in terms of understanding the government's policy on this. How large a body are they looking to create? What will it do? How much will it cost is a completely reasonable question when you're creating a new institution.
But the other thing is that's not in the referendum and that's not set by a referendum. So the government could come back and say it'd be a body of 80 people, the Parliament might wrangle various negotiations, it ends up at 180. Will the people then say, well, we didn't vote for this? Doesn't that present a problem?
Well, Tom, the referendum is about creating one body. And because we're looking at creating one body, the Australian people, I think, deserve to know how that body will function before they vote on it. Australians have been asking these sorts of questions because they want to have a sense of how will this body work? What sort of difference will it make? What sort of things can it advise on? They're not unreasonable questions. And the ordinary policy-making process when you have something like this would be to respond to the Langton report, to provide some detail for Australians so that people were better informed when they're voting in a referendum. I mean, the framers of our Constitution left to the Australian people the issue of amending our Constitution. They wanted Australians to be informed about what it is that they would be voting on. And we are asking questions that Australians have been asking us.
But even if those answers are provided to all 15 questions, they're not set in stone. The Parliament of the day decides it. That could change a few months later or 10 years later change significantly. So you are actually asking for questions and the answers will change no matter what, depending upon what the Parliament is made up of.
Well, Tom, if we're looking at a referendum in August, this Parliament is due to run till May 2025. It would be the same Parliament that will be dealing with the creation of a national body. I
But it can be changed at any moment.
It can be changed, but I suspect, like many institutions, that once it's established, the capacity to change it is there as a safeguard, but that it won't actually change very often. And so it is really important that Australians have an understanding of what this body will actually do and how the government envisages it, and to set up a process by which there can be some further discussion about how that will all work.
Not listed in the 15 questions, any concerns about whether a voice could affect broadly parliamentary sovereignty? Does that mean you're not concerned? You believe it can be inserted in the Constitution without endangering parliamentary sovereignty?
Well, look, I had expected that the government, in putting this forward, would set up a process whereby people could put forward a range of different ways of doing this, could test the words that the government's put up, could bring into play the views of legal and other experts to test the words of the government's particular proposed amendment. You know, the Prime Minister has said that particular form of amendment is not set in stone, and we keep waiting for that sort of process to be established. So, you know, the country can benefit from the views of a range of different experts, and the government can make any adjustments. But the idea that the Prime Minister says, well, we've got this form of words, no one's come to me with something else and my door's always open, is such an unorthodox process for the way in which you would deal with any form of legislation, let alone an amendment to the Constitution.
Well, just following up though, so are you saying you do still have a concern over potential sovereignty?
We would like to see a proper process put in place so the wording in the amendment can be tested and that you can have the benefit of advice from a range of different experts in relation to the meaning of the words in the amendment, and indeed why this particular amendment has been chosen. When Pat Dodson and I chaired a committee in 2018, we had no fewer than 18 different sorts of amendments to look at how you might establish this. And I've seen at least 2 or 3 other amendments that have been put forward since that time. Okay. There has to be a proper way of dealing with these things. That would be how you would deal usually with other legislation that's brought before the Parliament. I don't understand why the government hasn't done that here. I think it's a shame that they haven't so far.
It sounds like you're reserving the right, perhaps, for concern on that without expressing it just yet. Just finally, family law change is coming, according to what media reports today, although we can't seem to get on to the Attorney-General about this. But it's been described as putting children first. What will be abolished is the presumption of shared parenting. Not that it wouldn't happen, but that as a cornerstone, I suppose. What do you make of this potential change?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that at the centre of family law issues is the idea of the best interests of the child, and that is a fundamental principle in family law, and that's broadly agreed principle. We have said in the Coalition repeatedly that it is important for children to have a relationship with both parents. That's a very important principle as a starting point as well, save for, you know, where that's unsafe to do so. We will be looking at the government's legislation that they've put forward. I know they've got a discussion paper out at the moment. This is, you know, an orthodox way of making public policy, putting out a discussion paper, putting out some draft legislation. And we'll be looking at that and examining those things. But I think one important thing to say is that the Law Reform Commission report on which this particular discussion paper was based came out in 2019. The former government, the Coalition, made a series of reforms to the processes of the Family Court and the Federal Circuit Court. That has seen the dispensation and the dismissal and the dealing with of tens of thousands of cases more quickly. And it may be that this reform needs to be considered in the context of those changes that have already occurred to the processes and procedures of the Family Court and the Federal Circuit Court.
We'll let you get across that and talk to you, I'm sure, down the track. Julian Leeser, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tom.